Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. If you're joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies where you can tune into some great sessions on topics ranging from front-end technologies, UI UX, mobile apps to media, entrepreneurship, community building, and digital marketing. Today's webinar is our second foray into the Backdrop CMS. We have Jen, who is the co-founder of Backdrop, taking us through a real-time site upgrade from Drupal to Backdrop. Besides that, we will also look at themes, layouts, and configuration management in Backdrop. A bit more about Jen before we start. Besides being one of the co-founders, she is also a member of Backdrop's project management committee. Before leaving Drupal core development to create Backdrop CMS, Jen led the Twig initiative for Drupal 8. Owing to her experience as the director of Drupal training at Chapter 3, Jen's primary focus is to make both Drupal and Backdrop CMS easier to learn and easier to use. Thanks for joining us, Jen. And before we get started with the session, I would request all participants to please type in your questions during the presentation, and we will take them up in the last 15 minutes of the session. Also, please don't forget to take this conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us and Jen in your tweets using our handles @Srijan and @Jem Lampton. So without taking up any more time, let's get started. Jen, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to showing you guys how easy it is to upgrade from Drupal 7 to Backdrop CMS. I am, as she mentioned, one of the co-founders of Backdrop CMS. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm Jem Lampton. I'm also Jem Lampton on GitHub, and some of you might have seen me on Drupal.org as Jem Lampton as well. My website, jenlampton.com, is the site that we are going to be upgrading from Drupal 7 to Backdrop CMS today. So hopefully when we're done with this presentation, I'll be able to launch the new Backdrop site, and you guys can see that in the wild. So before we talk about how to upgrade from Drupal to Backdrop, I wanted to talk a little bit about why you might choose to upgrade from Drupal to Backdrop. And one of those things I want to harp on here is the fact that we really love Drupal here at Backdrop. That's why we forked the project. That's why we're trying to continue all of the traditions and everything that has been so successful in the Drupal community for the last 10 years. So if you love Drupal, moving to Backdrop might be for you. However, one of the things that I have found, I've been working with Drupal for about 10 years, and I found that a lot of my clients will make an initial investment in Drupal, and then a couple of years down the road, the cost of owning that website becomes more of a burden to them than they'd originally anticipated. And so what we're trying to do with Backdrop CMS is to create a more affordable version of very similar software. So not necessarily the initial cost of that website, but the cost of the long-term ownership of that website should not continue to increase over time. So if you're looking for something that's a lot like Drupal but will continue to fight to be more affordable, Backdrop might be for you. I should mention that Backdrop has almost the same set of features as Drupal 7, not entirely. We have removed a couple of things that were sort of edge cases in terms of what people were doing with Drupal. So if you're trying to run Drupal 7 on a database system that's not MySQL, for example, Backdrop won't be for you because Backdrop does not support that sort of thing. So if you have felt limited by the kinds of things you can do with Drupal 7, the Backdrop's probably not for you, and you should look at Drupal 8 as an alternative. But if you feel comfortable with everything you've been able to do with Drupal 7 and you aren't doing anything super specific to your site in terms of running a different database backend or needing alternate field storage, then Backdrop might be a good choice for you as well. So affordability is in Backdrop's mission statement. It's something that's very important to all people who are working on it, and it's something that we're going to continue to fight for in the coming years. So if you want to upgrade from Drupal, there's 4 easy steps that you can follow that will help get you there. The first step is to research what's going to be necessary to upgrade your website. Every website is different, and they're all going to need a thorough review to figure out exactly what's going to be required to make the upgrade. The second step is to take your existing Drupal site and prepare it for that upgrade. And that will involve doing things like reverting your theme back to the default theme, disabling modules that you're not going to be able to use in Backdrop, or making sure that your database is in a state that the upgrade can work seamlessly. And we'll talk about more of the kinds of things that might present problems in that area in a minute. Then step 3 is actually upgrading your site, and that is just going to update Dot PHP just like you would go from an earlier version of Drupal 7 to a later version of Drupal 7. Backdrop upgrades from Drupal 7 in exactly the same way. And then the last step is just taking your site out of maintenance mode, making sure that your theme is working the way you want it to, and making sure that some of the new features that you get from Backdrop, like layouts, are set up in a way that works for your site. So we're going to go through all 4 of these steps on an existing site, and you'll get to see how the process works. So the first step is to research what's necessary to upgrade your site. So what's involved in that is taking a look at the theme that you're currently running. Some people are running contributed themes that you've downloaded from various places on the internet and are running on your site. But most people are running custom themes that were made specifically for that site. And so it's good to kind of take a look into the code of that theme and figure out what's going to be involved in porting that theme to see if you are able and willing to port that, or if you have a developer who can do it for you. So what you need to know about differences in themes between Drupal and Backdrop. The biggest thing is that your page template, what was the page.tpl.php file in Drupal 7, that is now managed by the layouts system in Backdrop. And this is because the Drupal system has always assumed that one layout will be all that's necessary for your whole website. Every page on your site should use the same layout. And that's been problematic in the Drupal world for a while, and we've come up with a bunch of different solutions to this problem. Some themes have what I call magic regions that appear and disappear whether there's any content in them or not. We have systems like context that allow you to define conditions on when blocks will appear based on different things that are going on the page. There are solutions like panels that completely replace the page rendering that's currently in Drupal with its own. It also adds a system of context and a bunch of more sophisticated block types that you can place within them. And all of these solutions in Drupal exist because the initial system of rendering a page was not complicated enough to match the use cases that were out there in the world. So in Backdrop, the layout system is a port of the panels module with an entirely new user interface. But it's going to replace not only the content in the middle of the page, but the entire contents of the page template. So you're going to delete the page template from your old theme, and that will become layouts in BackdropCMS, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are also a bunch of minor markup changes throughout the theme system in Backdrop. We have switched to using HTML5. So in Drupal 7, where a lot of the elements were divs, in Backdrop we're now using other tags like article, nav, section, and aside. And that will mean that your CSS will need to be updated if you had been targeting a div tag. So if you've been after like div.node, that will just need to be updated to either be article.node or just .node, and then you'll have to do some checking to make sure that the CSS is still working as intended. And we've also moved away from using identifiers. In Drupal 7, a lot of the elements on the page had unique identifiers, which ended up being problematic when you put 2 of them on the same page. Those identifiers are no longer unique. So in Backdrop, we've changed almost all of the IDs to classes. So where we used to have ID equals page title, we now have class. So again, that will require a change to your CSS file in your theme to make sure that instead of having a pound, you have a dot. So again, this is not a huge amount of change, but it is something that you'll need to check carefully to make sure that your style sheet will still apply to your Backdrop theme. Also within the template files, there have been a couple of changes. Most notably in Drupal 7, we had a pre-process layer where things like arrays were assembled. So if you wanted to create an array of classes for a specific tag, you would be able to manipulate that. And then there was also a process layer where that array of classes was flattened into a string, and so that when you're in your template file, that set of classes can be printed out as a plain variable. So you just have a print statement and the variable classes. In Backdrop, we thought that having a pre-process layer and a process layer would be really confusing for new people to figure out. So we got rid of the process layer, but what that means is in your template file itself, you actually have to explode those arrays into strings. So when you go to print an array of classes, you have to use the function implode that will separate each class with a space. And similarly, if you're trying to print more than classes but the attributes, we have a function in Backdrop called Backdrop Attributes. Drupal has the same one actually that will do the same thing. It will implode an array, a multi-directional array, into a string for printing in the page as well. So there's just a little copy pasting that needs to happen in your template files to make sure that you're not printing arrays, that you're actually imploding them into strings first. Another difference between the Drupal 7 template files and the Backdrop template files is that we have decided that calling functions is just fine, and this also comes from the removal of the process layer. In Drupal 7, we called functions in the process layer so that we could print variables in the template file. In Backdrop, we just decided to print directly from those function calls in the template files. So there will be a couple of places where there are things that were previously variables that are now functions. And it's pretty easy if you're porting a theme to look at, for example, your version of the node template, open up Backdrop's version of the node template, and just copy and paste the minor differences into your template file. So you don't have to replace the whole thing, you don't have to port the whole thing, you just have to look for those differences and update them. Another thing to take a look at is the layouts that are provided by Backdrop Core. So we've compared our theme. It looks like there's not a lot in there that needs to be updated, which is great, except for that first item that said that our page template needs to be replaced by layouts. So we need to kind of take a harder look at the layouts that are provided by Backdrop Core and make sure that everything that we're doing in our page template and any variant of that page template can be covered by the layouts that are provided. So Backdrop Core, as of 1.4, which was released on Monday, has 10 layouts in Core, and these are pretty flexible. You can see from the screenshot here, we've got a header and a footer region on every page. We have a top and bottom region on every page, and we have a variety of different ways to handle your content and sidebars in the center of your page. So if you have 2 equal columns, 3 equal columns, 4 equal columns, we've got you covered. If you need 1 sidebar, 2 sidebars, we've got that covered as well. But if you need a more complicated layout of content that is not covered by these 10 layouts that are in Core, you might have to create your own layout for Backdrop. A layout is very similar to a theme in that it just includes an info file, a template file, and a CSS file. So if you're comfortable working in a theme, you're probably more than capable of creating a layout for Backdrop. It's just a matter of figuring out where you want your content to go, what you want those regions to be called, and dropping it into the layouts directory so that your Backdrop site can use it. All right, the last step of doing your homework before doing an upgrade is reviewing the modules that are currently in use on your Drupal site. And I like to divide the modules into 3 different categories. There's custom modules, these are ones that you've written yourself. There's core modules, these are the ones that come with Drupal 7. And these are they're contributed modules, and those are the ones that you download from Drupal.org or GitHub or anywhere else that contributed modules are distributed. And reviewing these takes a little bit more effort than reviewing a theme because modules can do more things, but we'll just talk about how you can decide whether your site is ready for upgrade or not. So custom modules, this is always the biggest pain point for me when I'm doing an upgrade, to try and figure out how many customizations have been done to any particular Drupal site. Almost every site I do has one custom module. Sometimes it doesn't do very much. It'll just alter something that I needed to have altered. And sometimes it'll do a lot. Sometimes it'll add a whole bunch of functionality that is very specific to that site. So checking to see how many modules you have is the first thing. That'll give you kind of a gauge of how much time you're going to need to spend updating them, and then trying to figure out how complicated they are is also really important. How much are they doing, and what are the things that they're doing that are different from how Backdrop would do them? So once you figure out those things, then you have to try and decide if you're able and willing to port your modules to Backdrop too. So how do you decide that? You're going to need to know what's different between Backdrop and Drupal. The most important thing in order to run a Drupal 7 module on BackdropCMS is to add a 1-line change to the info file for that module. So in Drupal 7, there's a line that says core equals 7.x, and that's so that your module knows which version of Drupal core it's going to be compatible with. Backdrop has a similar line. You need to add backdrop equals 1.x, which will let Backdrop know which version of Backdrop that module is compatible with. And it is definitely possible for you to have both of these lines in that info file at the same time. So you could, in theory, have a module that will work for both Backdrop and Drupal at the same time. Once you've made this one change, you can turn on your module and see if it's going to work without any additional changes. And you might be surprised, there's a lot of cases where it will work exactly as expected after making that one change. So depending on what you're doing in your modules, you might be done. All you might need to do is make this one change. And that's because the APIs between Backdrop and Drupal are very similar. And our goal was to make it as easy and fast as possible to port these modules. So we have a backwards compatibility module in Backdrop that will allow you to run all of the Drupal functions. So for example, any function that starts with the word Drupal, there's a wrapper in there that will make that work for Backdrop as well. However, there is more things that you likely want to do to your custom modules, even though you'll find that some of them will work exactly as they did in Drupal 7, just by making that one change in the info file. There are features in BackdropCMS that you might want to take advantage of. So even though you can get it working really quickly, you won't be able to use things like configuration management without a little bit more change to those modules. So Drupal 7 modules, almost every single one that I've seen has used these functions, variable set and variable get. And what those functions do is save and retrieve variables from a database table called variables. If you want to be able to configure your site and then deploy changes from one environment to another, you probably want to take use of the configuration management system that's new in Backdrop and also in Drupal 8. And in order to do that, you need to get these variables or configurations out of the database and into configuration files. And so that means you have to stop using the functions variable set and variable get and start using the functions config set or config get. And what config set and get will do is write those values of those variables into configuration files, which you can then manage with version control or deploy manually across different environments of your site. So even though you can get the module running, you might not be happy with Backdrop unless you can get configuration management working for that module as well. So I usually spend some time every time I update a module also making sure that I'm using the config system instead of the variable system, and that things are saving and retrieving as I would expect. There's another significant difference in how Backdrop handles its classes. So in Drupal 7, in the info file, if you loaded a class, you had to add a special line that says files equals, and then add in a path to that file. Well, in Backdrop, we've removed the class registry that did the auto-loading of those files, and we now have a hook autoload info that'll let you define where that class is. And so even though you can probably get your site working without making this change, it's definitely much better to point Backdrop to the location of your file, and that will prevent your registry from getting corrupted if you do something like move a file from one location to another. I have this problem all the time where I'll take a module and I'll move it from, for example, the sites all modules directory into a sites all modules contrib directory, and if that module contained a class, Drupal will be looking in the old location for the class even though I've moved it, and my registry gets corrupted and need to do a registry rebuild to get my site working again. So in Backdrop we decided, let's get rid of the registry and let's just have a hook that tells the system where the classes are, and so now that registry won't ever get corrupted, but you need to make these changes to your files as well. So there are a bunch of very small changes like this that are necessary for modules to run in Backdrop. Some of them are big, I think, developer experience wins, like things that have frustrated me a lot of times in Drupal we tried to get solved in Backdrop, and hopefully that will help making it, when you have to make the, feel good about it because you feel like you're making improvements, not just doing a bunch of busy work. So overall, there are not a lot of differences between the Backdrop APIs and Drupal's. and our goal is to make it really easy to port modules from one system to another. Now, depending on the modules you're running, the amount of work that's involved in making that port can be very different. If you're running something like a simple field module from Drupal, that should just be an info file change and you're done. But if you're trying to port something as complicated as Drupal Commerce, that's going to take a significant amount of time. So just for reference, it took us about 2 weeks to port the rules module to Backdrop, and that's one of the big ones. So in terms of the maximum amount of time it takes to port something, you're looking at probably 2 weeks or less. Most modules can be ported in an hour. All right, so once you've looked at your custom modules and figured out how much work is involved in that, it's good to review the other modules you're using as well. I like to look at core modules next because Backdrop did remove I think maybe 10 or 12 modules from Backdrop Core. So you should look at Core and try and figure out if any of the modules that have been removed are modules that you're using on your site. A lot of these modules exist in Contrib. So if you need them and you see that they're not in Core and Backdrop, you can grab them from Contrib and drop them in just like another Contrib module. But a lot of times the modules that we removed are ones that weren't necessary. So for example, we removed the toolbar module, but we've added admin bar. So there is a replacement. You don't need to worry about toolbar in Contrib. If you really want toolbar, you can port it, but for the most part, we think that's not going to be necessary because we've added an alternative module that will help you navigate your administration. We've also removed some modules like PHP, which were generally a bad idea, though there are a lot of sites that are using that module. You should kind of take this time to look at that and say, do I really need this module? Is there another way to solve that problem that might be better? And if you do have a use case that requires that you need that module, you are, of course, welcome to port it. And if you put it into Contrib, other people can use it as well. You might find other people have done that before you. So definitely take a look in Contrib and see if any of those modules that you need are there. However, if they're not, you might have to port them yourselves. So again, taking a look in the code and figuring out how much work is involved in porting that module is also going to be a good idea. The next step is to review contributed modules. And the first thing I would like to mention is that we have taken a handful of the most popular contributed modules for Drupal and moved them into core for Backdrop. The same thing happened for Drupal 8. A lot of the most popular modules in Drupal 7 got moved into core in Drupal 8. So definitely take a look at some of the contrib modules that you're running in your Drupal 7 site and see if they've been included. In the upgrade that we're about to do, there are going to be a handful of contrib modules that have been moved to core, so we'll get to point those out as well. If the modules have not been moved into core, you'll want to search for them on the BackdropCMS.org website and see if they exist in Contrib already. If you can't find them on the BackdropCMS website, it doesn't mean they don't exist for Contrib, it just means they probably don't have official releases yet, so there could be other people working on them, and it's a good idea to look in the GitHub Contrib repository as well. However, if you do find modules that haven't been ported, you might also need to port these. So again, hopefully it'll take an hour. In worst case scenario, you're looking at 2 weeks. That'll help you figure out how long it will take to port a site to Backdrop. All right, so once you've done your homework and looked at all of your module themes and layouts and figured out if you're ready to go, if it looks like you don't have that much work to do, the next step you need to do is take a look at your Drupal 7 site and make some preparations before porting. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that all of your modules in Drupal core itself are on the latest stable versions. So this will make sure that any of the updates that need to be made to your database or any of the latest changes that have happened to that code is all been taken care of before you try and upgrade from Drupal to Backdrop. But if you upgrade all of that stuff, you can turn on Update Manager module, and it'll tell you if you're out of date or not, and you can turn that off again when you're done and get ready for your upgrade. Now, one thing I like to say 4 or 5 times when you're doing something as crazy as a site upgrade, especially from Drupal to Backdrop or from Drupal 6 to 7 or 7 to 8, you should back up everything every step along the way. In Drupal, you want to back up the database, so that's making a SQL dump. You want to back up your code base, so that's everything inside Drupal core, and there's also a files directory, and this directory is usually located in the site's default files directory, but sometimes that can be moved elsewhere. So definitely make sure that you track that and track it separately from your code, because files need to be treated more like data than they do like code. And once you've made backups of everything, put a copy in a safe place. I've seen a couple of times people will make a backup of things, but they'll leave it inside their doc root and then still somehow accidentally delete the code. Definitely make a backup, tar it up, put it somewhere else. Move it, download it if it's on your server, move it to a different folder if it's on your local computer. Just make sure you've got backups of everything and that they're in a safe place. All right, so once you've made backups of everything and you're on the latest versions of code, you're ready to prepare your Drupal site for an upgrade to Backdrop. So we're going to start by disabling the core modules that have been removed for Backdrop. So, for example, if you want to disable Toolbar, if you want to disable Dashboard, you can disable and uninstall those modules. However, I put a note here to be careful when you're doing this because there are some modules that have been removed from Backdrop, for example, poll and blog. These modules provide content types, and if you have created content of type poll and you disable the poll module, the content that you have in your database won't know what type it is. So you'll need to be a little bit careful in this step and make sure that you have all of those content types created separately from the modules before you disable those modules or uninstall them. So disabling is safe, uninstalling is not safe because that's where you go to you can accidentally delete data that way. So just be careful as doing that step. The next step is to change your active theme back to core. So if you're running a contributed theme, you'll want to switch to Bartik. There is a way that you can upgrade a site leaving your current theme the way it is, but I like to change it to Bartik just to make sure that everything is working the way it should be, and then I can change it back. It gives me a good way to check on things and make sure I haven't broken anything along the way. And then the last step is to put your site into maintenance mode. And this is something that is recommended if you are trying to upgrade a live site. I, however, would never recommend actually trying to upgrade a live site. I think that's always pretty dangerous, and you should do it on a local machine or on a development machine first. Sometimes you can do it 2 or 3 times just to make sure the process is smooth, and if it goes smoothly, then you can repeat the process on the live site. Sometimes you can just take your live site offline, run through the process wherever is a safe location, and then upgrade or import your upgraded site over your live site. So whatever workflow works best for you is fine. I would just say do not try it first on the live site without doing it in a safe place first, just in case something goes wrong. All right, once your Drupal site is ready for update, then you dump the database. So this is a database of your Drupal 7 website. Then you take the database of your Drupal 7 website and you import it into your Backdrop website. So the way that I like to do this is to actually have 2 separate websites running at the same time, and we'll go through this in a minute, where you can export from the Drupal site and import into the Backdrop site, and then that way you can compare them side by side so you can make sure everything is working correctly at the end. It is possible to just take your Drupal database and point your Backdrop site at it. That will also work, but if your Drupal site is pointed at it too, then the two will get very confused because they're both trying to work off the same database. So I like to keep those separate. So after you import the prepared database into Backdrop, then you upgrade. And this works exactly the same way as updating from an earlier version of Drupal 7 to a later. You visit update.php, and Backdrop will handle taking all of your configuration out of the database, storing it into configuration files, and making whatever other schema changes are necessary for the database. So there, I think, are 123 updates that it goes through, and it only takes a few seconds. So even though it's in theory a little scary, you'll find that in practice it goes really quickly and it's not very scary at all. All right, and then the last step in doing an upgrade is turning everything back on your site. So this is logging back in and turning on your theme. This is, of course, after you have updated your theme for Backdrop. Also setting up and adjusting your layouts. So we'll go through this again. You'll see what will happen to your layouts after you update your site, and then we'll go through switching back to a layout that's going to work better. And then double checking, triple checking that everything is working the way you intended. Click around to all the pages on your site, make sure everything is rendering correctly, you're not getting any fatal errors or any PHP notices, and once everything's working correctly, then you can disable maintenance mode and go back online. So I usually run through this process a couple of times in a safe place on my local machine or on a development machine. Once I'm sure it'll work exactly how I want, then I'll do the same thing on a live site. So that's it. Let's do it. All right, so what I'm about to do now is go through a live update for upgrading from WordPress to Drupal, or sorry, upgrading from Drupal to BackdropCMS. And before we do that, I wanted to let you guys know that we've got a poll that'll ask how much experience you have doing upgrades before. So if you've upgraded from Drupal 5 to Drupal 6, 6 to 7, that sort of thing. So if you wanted to go ahead and take that poll, that would be really useful. All right, so
so the poll is now open, and you can choose more than one option, and then we'll have a quick second poll to know what kind of upgrades you have attempted.
So I've got, just to walk you through the website that we're about to upgrade, I've got a website that is basically just an online resume. So it's a single column layout. On the first page it has some experience with Drupal and Backdrop. It has a list of presentations that I've done recently, and it has a blog. At the very top there's a link to the blog. And so this is a very simple site, but it is a Drupal site. It's got some contributed modules. It has a custom module. It has a custom theme. And so we'll get to go through checking and seeing how ready the site is going to be, how much work it's going to be, and then we're going to upgrade it to Backdrop. So that's the live site. I'm going to go back to a local copy of the site that I've got running. This local copy I'm logged into so that we can go ahead and take a look at the modules page. So that's where I'm going to start. I've already taken a look at the theme, and there's not that much going on in the theme. I've got a couple of template files that needed to have the variables updated so that they would print imploded versions of arrays rather than single ones, but that was it for my theme, so it was pretty straightforward to port that. And then on the modules page, I'm not using the aggregator module, I'm not using the dashboard module, I'm not using overlay, I'm not using toolbar, I'm using admin menu instead, I'm not using PHP filter, poll, RDF. There's a lot of stuff going on here that I've already disabled, and so I'm not going to be using any of the modules that have been removed from Backdrop, which is good. In terms of custom modules, I don't think I have any on this site. There is one in the code base. Oh, no, I do. It's customizations. And what that module contains is a form alter that changes the way the user login form works. And so that module will work exactly the same in Backdrop as it did in Drupal, so it isn't going to require anything other than an info file change, which is great. And then in terms of contributed modules, there are a handful here that we should take a look at. The code filter module is something I'm going to need to download from BackdropCMS.org. Path auto and token have been moved into core. The honeypot module, that's contrib, and I'll have to download that one. Google Analytics, I'll have to download that one. Views module has been moved into core for Backdrop, so I won't need to do anything for that. And then the references module, I have downloaded that from contrib as well and put it into the modules directory for Backdrop. So there's a handful of modules here. There's also some link a field module that's also been moved into core into Backdrop. So I can kind of take a look at this list of modules and say, 4 of these that used to be contrib are now in core, and 5 of them that are currently in contrib also need to be added to my new Backdrop code base. So I've gone ahead and done that and set that up. And then the next step is to take a look at my modules to make sure they're the latest versions. And I have done that already. I did that yesterday to make sure that everything is running the latest version of everything so that when I make the upgrade it'll go smoothly. And then the next step is to back up everything. So I usually like to make a backup of my Drupal site before I make any changes at all, just to make sure that I have the latest version of Drupal in case you ever need to roll back. So that's always good. The step after that is to go ahead and update my theme. So if I go to my theme page, you can see I'm running one here called Pretty in Purple. What I want to do is change back to Bartik as the default theme. So let's see, it looks like I've got that running already. Let's go to home here. All right, so it's ugly, right, because I've disabled my other theme, but it does still show the content the way I expect it to, and it is ready to be moved to Backdrop. So the next thing I'll do is make another set of backups of everything, just so that I have a pre-Backdrop version. So I've got one version of backups that is exactly as my site was when it was live, and then another one that is exactly as it is right before I'm going to make the update to Backdrop. Then I also have a local Backdrop site running. I have all of the code that comes from Backdrop core, as well as the theme that I've ported, the contributed modules that I've downloaded from BackdropCMS.org, all put together and ready to go, but I do not have a database hooked up to my site yet. And so what I'm going to do is export the database from my Drupal site and import the database into my Backdrop site here. And then if I go to update.php, oh, I don't think I imported it correctly. Okay, hold on just a minute. It does help if you import the database into the right one. All right, let's try that again. Back to full screen. All right, let's do it correctly. Update.php. Okay, so another thing that you guys should know is that if you're not logged into your site, there is a setting in settings.php that you can change that will allow you to upgrade without being logged in. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change too. So in update free access, we'll change that to true. Nothing like doing a live demo. All right, here we go. Come on now. Dun, dun, dun. Hey, all right, so this is what's supposed to happen. If you go to update.php, you'll get taken to the installer page, but it'll recognize that you have an existing database there. This page will also tell you that you should back up everything, which is good, and put your site into maintenance mode. So when you click the continue button here, it will tell you that it needs to go through 126 updates. There's 123 in core, and I have a handful in the contributed modules that I'm running as well. So I'm going to go ahead and apply these updates, and it'll go through converting all of your configuration from the database into files, and it will set up your Backdrop site using all of the new core modules that are there. It goes pretty quickly, so that's now done, and it'll tell us, FYI, you should change that variable in your settings.php file back for security reasons. So if we go to the front page now, hooray, you'll notice that there is a Backdrop site here ready to go. It'd be good if I had login. So I'm pretty sure. Can't get to my. Login tool. All right, so we log in. I can show you some of the differences here between Drupal and Backdrop if you haven't seen them before. Right away, the admin bar is there, but it's got drop-down menus, whereas the previous toolbar module in Drupal didn't. It is also responsive, so if you are accessing your website on a mobile phone or tablet, you can shrink it down. You'll notice that it collapses nicely. It's also mobile-friendly, so if you're using a touch device, you can use touches to pop open the menus instead of hovers, which is good. There's also a search box in the menu, so if you're looking for something like views, the search box will help you find where in the navigation those pages are. So you can find existing views that you can edit, you can add a new view, and if you don't know where it is, use the search box and it'll pop open the part of the menu that admin is located in, which is pretty handy. On the page right now, you'll notice that it looks still a lot like Bartik. There's a reason for that, right? We just upgraded in the Bartik theme. And all of my content is kind of all squished together in the center column. There's a reason for that, too. That's because we switched from the Bartik layout to a new layout in Backdrop using the layout system that is equivalent to the Bartik layout from the Bartik theme. So the first thing I want to do is go to my layout section of my site, and this is where you have to convert from what was previously your page template to now a different layout in Backdrop. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the default one. By default, it's going to use the Bartik shaped layout, which in Backdrop is called Simmons. So we're going to edit this. This is our default layout. It will work for every page on our site unless otherwise noted. And what we're going to do here is change from Simmons to example the one-column layout, because this is a very simple one-column site. So if I click Save Layout here, it'll move all of my content around for me. Now you can see I have a header region where I have the header block in the main menu, the top region where I have a breadcrumb, I've got content, I've got all of my blocks here, recent presentations, resume blocks, and a footer down at the bottom. So there's a couple of things that are different about my site than about the Bartik site. One thing that's a little funny about my site is that I've put the links to things I need directly in my header, so I don't actually need the main menu, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that block. And I also want my breadcrumbs to be in my header and not in my the top region on my site. That's because I wanted them above the page title. So I'm going to go ahead and move those around and click Save. Everything else should have imported correctly from Drupal. So now if I go back to the home page, we should see that we are full width. And once we're full width, which is great, we should also have all of the other things we wanted, like our presentations block and all of the skills appearing there too. So resume block's working. So that's good. Good first step. We've got our content laid out the way we want. The next thing we need to do to restore is to change the theme. So if I go to the appearance section, I should have a Backdrop compatible version of Pretty in Purple. I'm going to enable that and set default, which is great. And it's going to notice here saying that the admin theme is set to 7. This is the same theme I was using on the previous site. That's actually what I wanted on my other site. I was using 7 for an admin theme too. But if you want a different admin theme, you can change that. And then what we'll do is go back home, and we should see the same site we had before. So again, this is a pretty simple example. I don't have that many modules on the site. Only one custom module I'll add is a form alter. I have a theme that is very basic in terms of what it does in terms of adding color. One of the modules I had was a field module. The link module moved into core. Another one was the references module. That was used for my blog posts so that you could reference one from another. But really, this is a very straightforward site. I ported this site from Drupal to Backdrop in less than a day, and that's kind of what we're hoping for. The faster we can make it for people to move from Drupal to Backdrop and from Backdrop 1 to Backdrop 2, that's going to help lower the cost of long-term website ownership. So everything seems to be looking and working exactly as my Drupal site, which is great. I would like to point out we have this status indicator light in the toolbar. This is telling me right now that my settings.php file has been updated so that update free access has been changed. You guys watched me change that so you know what that warning is. This little red dot will go away if your status report is happy. If everything here is green or yellow or blue, you're not going to get that error message. So as soon as I change that back, this will go away. But it will bother you if something's wrong. So hopefully that'll help you figure out what's going on. All right, so that's all I have for the live update. Again, I didn't go through any of the code because there's it's a little too much details, but I do have it if you guys have any questions about that. So yeah, maybe we should switch back here and see if you guys have any questions. All of this information, just in case you were wondering, is all online on the BackdropCMS.org website. There is a specific section for upgrading. There's one for upgrading between versions of BackdropCMS, and there's a much longer page about upgrading from Drupal. So don't worry, you don't need to memorize this whole thing now or be frantically taking notes. Obviously, you can come back and watch this video later, but you can also read through the steps to upgrade on the BackdropCMS.org website. Upgrade-from-Drupal is the URL or the path that information's on.
Thank you, Jen. That was surprisingly on time. It's exactly 10:15, and we have like 15 minutes for the Q&A. And that was a really detailed presentation, so thank you for that. Now, we do have a couple of questions with us, and before we get started with them, I would just like to ask all our attendees that if you have any more questions, please start typing them in, and we will take them up one by one. So the first question is there any sort of documentation where all the differences between Drupal and Backdrop would be mentioned?
Yes, so we have a set of change records on Backdrop's API website. So this is api.backdropcms.org, where if you search for example, the name of a function, not only will you get the definition of that function just as you would on Drupal's API site, but you'll also get any change records that relate to that function. So for example, if you looked for Drupal adds CSS, you would get a change record that said that that function was changed to be called Backdrop adds CSS, in addition to a Drupal add CSS function that exists in Backdrop that is a wrapper around the Backdrop add CSS function. So all of the API changes are documented in change records on the API site. If you want to read them all, you can. However, I find that it's not usually necessary to do that if you're porting a module, because you can just kind of turn on the module and see what happens. And usually there's only one or two errors, and if you take those errors and the functions that are related to those errors and plug them into the API site, you can find the two things that are missing from your module or the two changes that you need to make in order to get that to work.
All right. So the next question is, instead of an upgrade, can the migrate module be used in this case?
Yes, so if you like using the migrate module, if you prefer that to using the upgrade, you can use it. It exists for Drupal 7. It can also be ported to Backdrop just like any other module can. But our goal was really to make it so that people could upgrade from Backdrop to Drupal with writing as little code as possible. And the migrate module requires that you understand your previous architecture and your next architecture, and you write the migration. If you want to do that anyway, if you're doing something like rebuilding a site from scratch and have a bunch of old content in a Drupal 7 site that needs to be moved around, that's definitely a good way to do it. But yeah, our goal was to make it so that it wasn't the only way to do it. You can also just use update if you aren't changing your architecture or anything about your site.
All right. Next up is that if a lot of stuff in Backdrop is so much similar to Drupal 7, and we are already quite familiar in working with Drupal 7, what is the major advantage of transferring to Backdrop?
That's an excellent question. And it will depend on any given developer what they want to do. Like, there are lots of good reasons to continue to build sites in Drupal 7. For me personally, the reason that I want to move to Backdrop is because of configuration management. It's the one feature that I felt was always kind of missing from Drupal 7. In the past, we've used the features module to manage changes, and I find sometimes I spend so much time just clicking around in the features modules trying to resolve circular dependencies dependencies, trying to get exports up to date or features reverted, that it's a pain. I feel like it's not an efficient way to solve the problem. Now, granted, it's the best solution we had in Drupal 7, and before features it was much worse. But configuration management has kind of solved this problem from the ground up. It works on things that features doesn't work on. It works on content types and fields, obviously, but also deeper into the system with variables and menu items and things that features was just really hard to get working with. So for me, there's a huge time saver as a developer in deploying changes using Backdrop versus deploying changes using Drupal 7. I also prefer the layout system in Backdrop to trying to use the panel system in Drupal 7. They're obviously very similar. Layouts is a port of panels, but the user interface of panels module in Drupal 7 is hard to train people on, and I find the layouts user interface is a lot simpler. So those are the two most compelling reasons for me to switch. If people are front-end experts, they might also find frustration with using Drupal 7's version of jQuery is pretty old, and so when you first start building a Drupal 7 site these days, the first thing you usually do is add the jQuery update module that will get you up to date. It's just one less step when you start with software that's new and up to date to just kind of drop it in. Same thing is true for rich text editing. We have a rich text editor in Core and Backdrop. If you're going to start with Drupal 7, you've got to add that, and sometimes it's a pain to just set that thing up. So it's not that you can't do any of this stuff with Drupal 7. You obviously can't. Drupal 7 is a proven successful product. We just tried to make it a little bit easier on the developers and the site builders with Backdrop. So hopefully that'll be a time-saving measure, and it'll help make it fewer hours and faster to get your site up, which hopefully should translate to fewer dollars for your clients.
All right, so we just had another question asking about the main differences in themes between D7 and Backdrop.
So the biggest difference is the fact that your page template, what was usually your page.tpl.php, that was managed in code, like where those blocks were positioned and how you might have a page -- front that's different from your page, or you might have a page -- article. In Backdrop, all of that is managed in configuration instead of in code. So you go to the layout system and you can create a layout that'll work for all of your pages. That's equivalent to the page.tpl.php. Then you can create specific overrides. So you can create a layout that's just for your front page, and that will only work for your front page, and that's equivalent to your page -- front. And so what you're doing is you're selecting from a given set of layouts, like there's 10 in Core. You can choose any of those for any of those use cases. But then you're placing the blocks in them, and the block placement is stored in configuration. The layout template file is either provided by Core, Contrib, or you can write your own. But the significant difference is that those things are separate. That it's no longer up to your theme to decide where things go on the page. So if you change your theme, you can change the color, you can change the font, you can change whatever. You don't have to go back and rebuild your site in terms of putting all those blocks back into the regions, which was something that was a bit of a pain point in Drupal 7. So that having that huge separation of layout being different from theme is a big deal. It's kind of like when you're working with the Bootstrap grid system, there's a layout chunk of CSS, and then there's an aesthetic chunk of CSS. Backdrop 1.4 includes the layout grid system, but it does not include the aesthetic part of it, because those two jobs are different. So we've kind of separated the layouts from the themes. In terms of other big differences, just removal of the process layer, that created the need to print and implode variables directly into the template file. So we call functions in template files. That's a little bit different. But otherwise, the only real differences in the theme layer are the HTML that's provided by default being HTML5. Layouts are responsive out of the box, so there's a little magic in there with breakpoints, and that's kind of it. I mean, if you know how to write a theme for Drupal, you know how to write a theme for Backdrop. All of the knowledge carries over almost exactly.
All right. Also, the next question is, do we have any Backdrop usage statistics, as in how many people are using Backdrop currently, and how's that going for them?
We do. We're using the same project usage module that Drupal is using. We've ported it over from Drupal. We found a bunch of bugs in how those numbers were being calculated, though, so we wanted to make sure that we got those numbers right before we released them on the wild. I think 2 weeks ago we finally got those numbers tracking correctly, not counting test sites, for example, if you're running the test system, not counting Travis, like the system that we use to run our automated tests after we make changes to Backdrop, was being recorded too. So after we removed all of the crufty numbers, it looks like there's a couple of hundred sites running Backdrop today. We will integrate those numbers and get them put up on the BackdropCMS.org website shortly, like probably in the next 2 weeks. If you are curious about it, the latest version of Backdrop does include a module that allows you to browse and install other modules directly onto your Backdrop site, and you can see the usage statistics in those numbers for the contributed modules. So if you want to see those, that's already integrated there. We just haven't got it integrated on our website yet because it wasn't working. But give us 2 weeks and we'll get those numbers up. Right now it looks like there's a couple of hundred active Backdrop sites reporting, and that doesn't include like dev sites and stuff like that. So unique active sites is a pretty good number. I mean, it's hard when you're comparing because Drupal has such such a vast community, but at the same time, I think it's, you know, if you compare it to any other project that's only been around for a year, I think we're doing really well. So very happy.
Great, that's really a great statistic to have a couple of hundred sites already running on Backdrop. So we have a last couple of questions that we are going to quickly take since we are running towards the end of the session.
Sure.
So how is config stored? Is it stored in YAML files?
So we took a slightly different approach than Drupal. In Drupal 8, their configuration is stored in YAML files. In Backdrop, it's stored in JSON files. And there's a couple reasons we went that route. First of all, JSON, there's native JSON parsing in PHP, so it ends up being about 75 times faster than parsing a YAML file. And we wanted to be able to store and read the config files off disk at all times. So we don't have a database cache. We're just reading it directly off the file. So if you need to make a change to a variable somewhere in your site's offline, you can just open the JSON file, find the variable, edit it, and save it, and it'll come back online. So having it be really fast so that it's always the active data was really important to us. And also we felt that we wanted the majority of developers to know how to work with these files. And we aren't using YAML anywhere else in Backdrop. We're using info files. And so we felt that JSON was kind of the most common language that the most web developers would already know how to use. So it seems like a win-win for us. We have different principles and guiding philosophies for the Backdrop project and the Drupal project. So even though we're solving the same problems, right, we're both producing this configuration management tool, we come to different decisions about how that should be done. And for us, appealing to the most developers was important, and making it as fast as possible was important. Whereas with Drupal 8, they're more concerned with making it consistent so that all of the files in core were using the same formats. So same solution, slightly different technical implementation.
All right. Another question is Backdrop core using panels?
No, so yes and no. We have ported the panels module to Backdrop. It has been rewritten slightly. Obviously, there's an entirely new user interface on it. So you don't need to know how to use panels in order to use Backdrop. But underneath, the code is the same. Like, we still have the same concepts of context and relationships. The one thing that is significantly different between panels and Backdrop is that we don't have this idea of variance. For us, a layout is a layout is a layout, and it doesn't matter whether it's on the same path as another layout or not. You can have 8 layouts at node/%, and once for each content type. So we thought variants were confusing to people in panels. We removed that. But underneath the code is exactly the same. So if you've written plugins for panels, you'll know how to write classes for Backdrop's layout system as well. It's very similar.
All right. The next question is, does Drush work with Backdrop?
Yes. So if you're using Drush 8, there is a project in the Backdrop contributed module space called Drush, which is a set of commands that you can drop into your local Drush directory or your local .drush that will make Backdrop and Drush work together. So we've been working with Greg Anderson, who's one of the Drush maintainers. He works over at Pantheon, and Pantheon runs Backdrop, so we have a little incentive there to get everything working together, which is fantastic. And he's been really helpful to us about pointing out how Drush does things, and we point out how Backdrop does things. We've been able to make them work together. So right now we have all of the most common Drush commands that you run, like drush dl, drush up, drush cc, drush cron, all the drush SQL commands all work with Backdrop. If you have a use case that is a little different than what is most common, you can create an issue in the drush queue for Backdrop, and we'll go ahead and get it added in. But we've just kind of done the ones that we thought everybody would want right away first. If somebody wants something we haven't thought of, we can add that. We do have to add a command in there that'll make it work for both. But yes, Drush does work with Backdrop now.
All right, and with that, we've come to the last question that we have for this session, and that is, should we expect support for Backdrop CMS as we do with Drupal?
Yeah, I would expect that it'll be about the same. I mean, in general, Drupal is proven, it's successful. Everything that has come about for Drupal so far is going to be almost exactly the same for Backdrop. The one thing that we're trying to improve is making it easier for new developers to pick up Backdrop than it was for Drupal. That was something that was a bit of a pain point. We want to lower that learning curve. But we also care so much about backwards compatibility that we're going to try and do that without making the existing developers need to learn too much that's new. So with every version of Backdrop, there will be about 80% code overlap from version to version, so that you won't have to relearn everything from scratch. And hopefully that'll help decrease the long-term maintenance and support costs for people. But I expect that anyone who's supporting Drupal today will continue, well, they'll be capable to support Backdrop tomorrow. And I would hope that they would be willing to do that as well. We found a bunch of support in the Drupal community already from big Drupal companies that are currently looking for Backdrop projects, which is really good because their employees want to work with it, their developers want to work with it too. So it's all shared knowledge. There's no reason it won't be the same across both platforms.
All right, that's really great to know. And we just got one more question. Can we join Backdrop just the same way as we join Drupal.org?
Yes, you can create a user account on BackdropCMS.org. Right now, there's not much you can do there. You can list yourself if you're a developer. You can list yourself as being available for hire. If you're a company, you can also post that you are available to do Backdrop work. So you can create a company profile on there. But that's all that you can do today. We are planning on adding a couple of great features in the near future where if you have built a site with Backdrop, you can post it in our showcase. We're planning on getting a bunch of other neat tools on there too in the coming few months. So I would say get your low user IDs now, but keep an eye out on new features that'll appear there soon.
All right, so okay, we have quite a bit more questions coming in. So I think one of our attendees did try logging into BackdropCMS.org, and the question is, instead of PHP, it's showing Pantheon, and why is that?
I don't know where that is, but I would have to look at it and see. It sounds like something might be wrong. I don't know. BackdropCMS.org doesn't have anything to do with Pantheon, so it shouldn't. It's not hosted there or anything, so it shouldn't. He might have, or whoever it was, might have clicked the spin up on Pantheon button, which would have given him a Pantheon Backdrop site to play with. So we do have like a demo button that will give you a Backdrop site. So if you wanted to use Backdrop, you could just push that button. That might be what he did. But if you log in, there's a login register link in the sidebar. That's separate, and that wouldn't take you to Pantheon.
All right. So it looks like we have managed to get quite a few of our attendees really excited about Backdrop CMS, and I would consider that a success. And with that, I think we have come to the end of our session today, and I would like to thank all our attendees for being such a great audience and asking such engaging questions. And I would definitely like to thank Jen for that really interesting presentation and the real-time demo that you gave us. And before I close out, I would also like to announce that our next webinar is on Ruby Motion, and it will be hosted on 1st of June 2016 and will be led by Lauren Sansonetti, founder and CEO at HipByte. For registrations and more details, you would be getting a mail from us, so stay tuned. And thank you once again for joining us today, and we definitely hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all our attendees.
Thanks so much.